the evidence from psychology, sociology, anthropology, biology, economics, education, leisure studies, all driving me to a very surprising and heretical conclusion, which is that competition isn't just bad news because we do it badly or do it to excess. It is inherently counterproductive, so that the very phrase healthy competition is a contradiction in terms.
Alfie Kohn is an influential author and speaker focused on education, parenting, and motivation. His 14 books include Unconditional Parenting, The Homework Myth, and my personal favorite, Punished by Rewards. Alfie is an unabashed critic of competition, arguing that pitting people against each other is inherently destructive. Join us as we dive into cooperative gaming, intrinsic motivation, and healthy alternatives to competition with the legendary Alfie Kohn. Welcome to our Game Thinking Academy. Today we have Alfie Kohn, who is an educational pioneer who has reached and touched many lives and continues to through his work and his books and his speaking and his writing. So welcome, Alfie. Thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here.
I want to start with a brief overview of some of your background and then really get into cooperative games, which is what you've written about. It's what our work revolves around, and really want to get your point of view. Were there experiences you had as a younger person that just really shaped you in the fire?
I think I would say in general that whenever I see solid evidence and good values pointing in one direction and see widespread practice going in a different direction, it pisses me off. And I know there's another book coming soon. So I narrow that gap and invite people back to their best values and show them the research. And that ends up challenging a lot of conventional practice at home, at school, at work, at play.
So you're very research-driven, data-driven. You want to see evidence and facts, it sounds like.
Yeah, if it's good evidence, although a lot of people claim studies show they're pushing the values underground and plus often not looking critically and carefully at the studies themselves. But yes.
So when did you first become aware of the difference between competitive games and cooperative games, the main topic we're going to talk about today? How did you get clear on, wow, these are really different things?
Well, I had experience as a camper and a summer camper and then camp counselor, and became increasingly discomfited by what I saw when people were set against each other. And I briefly considered writing a thesis on the topic of why it is, especially in our culture, that we are set against other people, so that the idea of excellence comes to be confused with victory. In other words, we are given the message that other people are potential obstacles to your success, meaning that we can reach our goals only if other people don't. And that's the heart of competition by definition, mutually exclusive goal attainment. I can't succeed unless other people fail. And that's not a part of life. That's a very contrived arrangement that turns out to be counterproductive, as I learned. And that became the topic of my first book, which is called No Contest, that looks at a range of different academic disciplines. The evidence from psychology, sociology, anthropology, biology, economics, education, leisure studies, and so on, all driving me to a very surprising and heretical conclusion, which is that competition isn't just bad news because we do it badly or do it to excess. It is inherently counterproductive. So that the very phrase healthy competition, I was eventually persuaded, although I didn't go in believing that, is a contradiction in terms. And one of the chapters in that book dealt specifically with play and games. And then I ended up writing more about that in an addendum to the book that was published some years later. I moved on to write about other topics having to do with the destructive effects of rewards, even when no competition is involved, dealing with topics of altruism and empathy, and then parenting. But this thread has continued throughout my entire career of realizing that it never makes sense to pit people against each other, and that even better than the absence of competition is the affirmative presence of cooperation. After all, those are two different things. In competition, I can succeed only if you fail. In an individualistic, non-competitive environment, I succeed regardless of what the hell you do. And in pure cooperation, I can succeed only if you succeed too. And that's why I've been interested to see how that can play out among other arenas in terms of having fun, where games require us to, in an allegedly playful fashion, overcome some obstacle to reach a goal. It's just that we're raised to assume that obstacle has to be other people, whereas in fact, it can be something built into the task itself, or trying to achieve this task in a way before the clock runs out, or something else where everyone on the field is pulling together. And it's not us against them any more than it's me against you.
Right. So in gaming, as you know, there are many, many competitive games, but there's also a wide world and a growing world of cooperative games. They absolutely exist. One of the challenges is it's often more difficult to create and run a cooperative game than a competitive game. So we're always looking for models of effective cooperative games and effective cooperative activities. As you've spoken to this subject, as you've worked with teachers, parents, groups, whatever, what are some models you've seen that work at different scales for effective cooperative activities and games?
I guess it's pretty easy to kind of look at your favorite cooperative games and then kind of work backwards, reverse engineer the principles that create the challenge for the task that doesn't involve having to triumph over somebody else, which is, you're right, the easier, because it's the default model. That's the easiest way to create a challenge. Is you and I have to wrestle at it, and one of us has to get there first or do something better. But there are other models that are present in offering elements of a task incrementally, so one has to continue to integrate new information. I'm remembering a cooperative board game I played that had to do with, was a Sherlock Holmes mystery, in which that was done very carefully. There was another one that you must know of, I think it was called Pandemic, all too timely. But I would imagine that a number of other board games for children, for example, created by the great little Canadian company called Family Pastimes, which has been around for almost 50 years now, or outdoor games for kids and adults, such as those created by or collected by a guy named Terry Orlick, also Canadian, by the way, that if you look at the way a lot of those games are structured, you could figure out, hey, the same principle could be used to create some kind of video game. You know, for example, let's take the first game most of us Americans were ever exposed to at birthday parties, in which N children are desperately scrambling to fit on N-1 chairs when the music stops. You take away a chair each time, you start the music up again, somebody's out. You do it again, out, 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 until at the end, you've got one kid seated, happy, the winner, everybody else excluded from play, unhappy, losers. That's how you learn to have fun in America. So Terry Orlick comes along and says, why don't we continue to take away a chair each time? But now the goal is for all the players to fit on a diminishing number of seats, until at the end, everybody is giggling and squishing and trying to figure out how to hold on so everybody can sit. You've got the artificial scarcity here in a way, but you've got a challenge where now the goal is for everybody to figure out how everyone can succeed, which becomes in this game increasingly difficult to do because the space is shrinking. That's the challenge, but we have to cooperate to make this work. I'll give you an outdoor game, bump and scoot volleyball. You hit the volleyball over the net and you run under the net and join the other team. And that's what keeps happening. The goal is to not drop the ball, keep it in the air until everybody has changed teams at least once. at the end, who won? Who can tell? The question no longer has any meaning because the teams are fluid. Also, people are too busy having fun to worry about who won, which is interesting in its own right. I like to say, until you've played a cooperative game, you really don't appreciate how much fun competition isn't. But notice that bump and scoot volleyball approach is very different from the model of cooperative musical chairs. There, it's not that the task is becoming increasingly difficult because of some feature of the objective environment. It's that the teams are being reshuffled. And there are other ways to do that too. In other games, every participant must make a defined contribution, or everybody's got to try to figure this out in a specified amount of time. There are many different models that are all cooperative. It just means that you have the wherewithal and the insight to begin by saying, let's figure out ways to create challenge that don't involve pitting people against each other.
So one of the things that you wrote is that recreation is a socialization tool that prepares children for adult roles. The recreation is competitive. This offers a kind of apprenticeship for life in corporate capitalism, where people are regarded as potential obstacles to one's own success. So as parents, if you speak to us as parents or grandparents, or aunties and uncles, people that interact with kids, what are some ways that we can embody cooperation with our kids that gets beyond the, hey, you get a gold star if you do your chores?
One of the reasons that competition turns out to be counterproductive is that it's not good for psychological health. If you are constantly thinking, I'm only as good as my last victory, that is a recipe for neurosis. And the research shows that when you make kids compete, it undermines their self-esteem. The second reason that competition is counterproductive is that it is destructive to our relationships because we end up envying winners and being contemptuous of losers and being skeptical about just about everybody, holding them at arm's length, because even if you're not my rival today, you could be tomorrow. And so research shows, not surprisingly, that people are less morally sophisticated, less helpful, less likely to imagine the way the world looks from someone else's point of view when they are put in competitive environments. It's not just about attitudes and dispositions of individuals, it's about structures. You take friendly, happy, moral people and you set them in a competitive environment and they look neurotic and seditious and vicious and so on. They tend to cheat, become more aggressive. Not because that's the kind of person they are, therefore not a problem that could be fixed by telling them to be good sports, but because of the systemic features of being put in a competitive environment. The third thing that's wrong with competition in general is that, and this is the part that surprised even me when I started writing my book, is that it's counterproductive in a very practical sense. People tend to do their best work when they don't have to worry about other people stepping on their faces or being distracted by having to step on other people's faces. Competition undermines excellence. And the more challenging the tasks, such as being inventive, higher order thinking, creativity, the worse the effect of competition. Now, why is that true? One reason competition tends to backfire is because it doesn't allow us to cooperate, which turns out to be very effective at most tasks, because all of us are smarter than any of us. But another reason that competition turns out to be counterproductive in terms of the effects, in terms of achievement, is because of its status as an extrinsic motivator, a doggy biscuit. Do this and you'll get that. Where now the point is not to code or to paint, or to spell or whatever it is. Now the point is to win. It turns out that the gold star, so to speak, the extrinsic inducement, is not limited to competition. And that's an important distinction. So if I say only the best kid gets a gold star or some other, a candy bar, whatever it is, that's a competition and an extrinsic motivator. It's like adding arsenic to strychnine. But if I say everybody who does X, who reaches this level of achievement, can get a gold star or an A in a classroom, Now we've moved one step forward by getting rid of competition, but we are still dealing with doggy biscuits, with extrinsic motivators. We haven't gone far enough. So grading on a curve is the worst thing to do. Grading not on a curve where everybody can get A's is not competitive, but it's still bad news because it's an extrinsic motivator. Best of all is offering assessment that is not an extrinsic motivator. As parents, we need to be mindful of all of this stuff. That means we don't even say things that we thought were innocuous, like, who's the best little girl in the whole wide world, which teaches that you're in a competition against other girls. Or to say, okay, kids, who can get into their pajamas fastest, which is a race. It's not innocuous. Now your siblings are people you triumph over, and you start to learn your siblings and maybe your classmates and other people in general are not potential friends and allies. They are potential rivals and so on. It means that we as parents have to take an active role in minimizing the presence of competition in our home life, but also look for alternative structures on Saturdays and Sundays, and to work with our kids' teachers to make sure that they are not falling prey to competition, which is our state religion, and that they realize just how much damage is being done when kids have to compete, when they are in spelling bees and awards assemblies and so on. And while minimizing the competitive ugliness of competitive sports is certainly a good thing, not getting carried away, I believe we need to create alternative recreational models like cooperative outdoor games, coming together and creating interest groups with other people in our community to offer purely cooperative games. Orlick found when he did a study that most kids who say they like sports, which are typically the kids who are good at it, are only enjoying it because they don't make an informed choice, having never been exposed to cooperative games. And when he taught them cooperative games as well as the usual, war minus the shooting, as George Orwell referred to sports, of hockey and football and baseball and basketball and soccer, almost all the boys and all of the girls preferred the cooperative games once they knew there was an alternative. So that's the best thing in terms of recreation we can do as parents. Not just say, hey, let's not keep score with 5 years old, or, let's celebrate all the kids and give them all trophies and not make a big deal about winning. Yeah, that's a tiny step forward. What we can really do to help them is to provide alternative forms of recreation so that when they're doing something competitive later, and there'll be plenty of that in our culture, they can say, this is not the only way to do things. This is not the only way to have fun. And in fact, it isn't as much fun because I've seen what it's like to play cooperatively. So using your resources, perhaps for video games and other resources, that's completely cooperative, we raise a generation that's not only healthier, has better relationships, happier, more productive, but also one that realizes the idea that competition is just human nature is false propaganda designed to keep us reproducing ways of being with each other that really are not ideal.
Why do you think cooperative games aren't more widely used if they're so much better?
That could be asked about competition and cooperation in general. Why isn't cooperative learning, the default in most classrooms? Why would we ever set people against each other in the workplace, given that it turns out the most effective approach in workplaces for adults too is not only to cooperate within groups, but to cooperate rather than compete among groups. So often we talk about teamwork, but we take away with one hand what we give with the other by setting the groups against each other, And
why do you think that is? Why do we default to that?
There are lots of things that continue, even though it's not because it's human nature. Part of it is just because it reproduces itself. Second, the more you compete, the more you're in a better position to win in the future. Another possibility is that people just have not been invited to understand the research just demonstrating that competition isn't just ineffective, but simply counterproductive. We tend to believe, because we like this middle of the road approach that sounds more reasonable, well, you don't want to get carried away and make kids compete like crazy and do it too early. But if you do some competition, you don't get carried away, you do it in a way that's reasonable, then it can be innocuous and even productive. Frankly, that's what I used to think, until I looked at the research and realized that competition is inherently destructive. For most people, that's a mind-blowing possibility, and also a very unsettling one, because it calls into question the way we were raised and taught. That leads to a different answer to your question, which is, it's really difficult to consider the possibility that a lot of my own life and my own childhood was based on a myth. And so we would rather perpetuate the status quo rather than ask deep, unsettling questions about our society, our family, and what we've been doing. So I think there are probably other reasons, historical reasons. I think for some people it's theological. A lot of people who are wedded to an economic system or a set of religious beliefs where competition plays a critical role. And this is why when I wrote my book, No Contest, I made a point of debunking the myth that it's just human nature at the very start. So we couldn't just shrug our shoulders and say, well, all your research showing that competition is ineffective, it's interesting, but there's nothing much you can do about it because we're just competitive. It's just the way nature works. It's just the way life is. So I used many different discipline research. So we are faced with the real question, if it's not inevitable, is it desirable? And if it's not desirable, then we've got to damn well do something about it, rather than just take, and this is yet another answer to your question, one reason to just believe we can't do anything about it so that it continues is because it asks a lot less of us when we believe that this is just the way life is. It sounds nice in theory to be cooperative, but your ideas are utopian or unrealistic. This is a profoundly conservative view posing as realism, which is very effective at shutting down change.
So are there cultures that you know of that have more cooperation in their founding mythology and in the games they teach their children?
I haven't focused specifically on games, but I gather that is true. And some of the early anthropological research in the 20th century found some cultures that apparently are devoid of any competition at all, not only in their games, but in how they produce and distribute resources, how they teach their children, and so on. And that is the ultimate rebuttal to the claim that it's part of human nature, is that there are some cultures that have managed to do completely without competition. Margaret Mead found, in fact, that the extent to which a culture is competitive or cooperative had nothing to do with objective scarcity of land or food or other resources. In fact, in many cultures, non-industrialized cultures, if stuff was scarce, they said, we can't afford to compete. We have to work together. So the choice of whether a culture is competitive or not is a function of sort of social myths, as you put it. It would be hard to find a culture that is more competitive than the United States, which is the reductio ad absurdum of this view that you can't succeed in life without triumphing over others and doing it to children even when they're young. There's like no activity that is too important or too trivial for us to turn it into a contest. And this is something I write about in my book, is example after example of stuff that, it's one thing with football, for example, or tennis, where you can't play the game unless you're trying to beat somebody. So you need to find a different game if you want to just have fun and not just beat people. But it's even more sad in a way when we take activities like running, or singing, or skiing, or swimming, or coding, and we gratuitously turn them into a contest where you set people against each other, even though there's no necessary reason why the activity should be that way. So that's the low-hanging fruit. Quit it. Stop doing that. And then, yes, turn to other cultures as well as to other sources within our culture for more ideas about how we create games. And we do that in part because of that quote you read at the beginning. Mm-hmm. Not only are we happier and healthier and more productive without competition, but competition is a profound socializing agent that raises kids to assume this is what life is, and this is the way business has to be organized, and this is the way you have to raise your kids. And a lot of people persist at this because they have literally never had the idea, raised with them that this is not inevitable, that the competitive approach is just one approach, not the only one, and not the ideal one.
I want to just give you an opportunity to tell us what you're doing these days. If there's anything coming up that you're excited about or that you'd like to point us to.
No major projects, but thanks for the opportunity. I'm happy to point people to a lot of the work that I've already done. My website, which is just my name, alfiekohn.org, has information about all my books, a couple of videos, and it also has hundreds of articles and blog posts on many different topics, particularly having to do with education and parenting, but also on other topics having to do with human behavior.
Absolutely. We've already shared it with our community, and we will link that and other direct links to your books, which have been just a great resource, in our show notes. So are there any other thoughts in terms of everyone listening who wants to lean into cooperation, wants to lean into this? Any other thoughts to leave us with, just to let us walk out of here with something to chew on?
I guess the two takeaways I would emphasize, one is it's not just a matter of doing less of a bad thing, but finding that some things are bad inherently and need to be questioned for what they are, asking the radical questions, the questions of the root. And the other and related takeaway I would mention is it's not just a matter of your personal competitiveness or cooperativeness and trying to change attitudes or mindsets or orientations, but making change in the structure. But the structure doesn't necessarily mean waiting until our entire society has undergone a revolution and been completely transformed, because the structural aspect can be true of what these 20 kids are doing right now on a field, or what happens in this classroom. Those are structural changes we can begin to make right now, even understanding that systemic transformation is ultimately more important than just transforming our own attitudes about things.
That's fantastic. That's an inspiring place to leave. I really appreciate your time, Alfie.
Sure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
It's been a pleasure. You have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.